Well, first thing I have to say is thanks, Alice, for being here. Okay. And you know, we always make these introductions. We always promise that we are going to be brief, then we are not that brief. So I'm not going to make any promise. I have to confess that I stole her bio from Kismith Conference's website. It's good that we are friends with Paula, so I guess there is no problem with this. Uh, that's where we met. I mean, I've been a fan. I think I told you that night that I remember listening to your music in this very old cassette that some friend gave me. So it was always Alice back in my head. But the truth is that we met just a few months ago in Porto, and it was a beautiful night, and we started talking, and finally this thing happened. So grateful to Porto and Paula because he's in the very origin of what's gonna go today. Okay, so anyway, I'm gonna be reading from what the people in Kismith published in their website, so you get to know a little bit better Alice, but she's gonna tell more interesting things later. Okay. So Alice Bag was born Alicia Armendariz in 1958 in East Los Angeles in California, the daughter of a Mexican immigrants, and grew up in a Spanish-speaking household. She's This is the definition that you could find in the website: singer, songwriter, producer, musician, author, artist, educator, and feminist. Which I think she's even more than this, but it's a beautiful list. As lead singer and co-founder of the Bags, one of the first bands to form during the initial mid-70s wave of punk in Los Angeles, is that some of us, we knew her, but the truth is that there is much more that came later. She was also in this all-female post-punk band called Castration Squad in the early 1980s. Also in the 1990s, she was in the pop punk queercore band Cholita, and in the Chicana feminist punk folk group Las Tres and Goddess 13. Yeah. She's also the author of the critically acclaimed memoir Violence Girl from East LA Rage to Hollywood Stage, a Chicana punk story, and the autobiographical Pipe Bomb for the Soul based on Bach's 1986 trip to Nicaragua. Okay. Then in 2016, she released her first solo album, which was reviewed in Pitchfork, and it was chosen as one of the best albums of the year. And then 2 years later, she also released Blueprint, and in 2020, I think it was the last one. Yeah, Sister Dynamite. Okay, and she's here today to talk about her experience back in LA in the 70s, and I guess that a lot of other things. The title of her presentations is Punk in the Wild Wild West, and I'm so happy that we have the opportunity to hear her voice and her wisdom. Okay, thank you, Alice.
Push that. Oh, there we go. Hi. Well, thanks for being here. And thank you to Angel for inviting me. When he invited me, I was thinking, like, wait, punk? And this is about the West. Okay, yeah, I can do that. I mean, West Coast punk. Even though it doesn't get as much attention as punk from other places, I think West Coast punk has its own personality, and it definitely has a legacy that it's pushing forth and that is still like resonating with people. So when I thought of the Wild West, the first thing I thought of was like gunslingers and saloons and just lawlessness, general lawlessness, and that's really not too different from what punk was like. But punk was also a place of exploration. And like these cowboys and maybe cowgirls, who knows, it's hard to tell from the shadow, but it was a place for people who didn't believe in those borders or felt like this is a frontier that needs to be crossed. I want to go out and find the unexpected and maybe create new things. So, in those ways, I feel like punks have something in common with these people. So, here we are. These are West Coast zines. I am maybe about 40 years younger here. And these are some of the bands that were popular when I was growing up. And I think since this is about literacy and literature, I think it's important to mention that the punk scene had its own zines, its own magazines, its own independent publications, where we would write about our own concerts, our own art exhibits, anything that had to do with punk didn't have to be validated by the mainstream press. We decided that part of what we could do was write about it ourselves. And besides these more glossy magazines that I just showed you, there were much smaller ones. Um, these were usually photocopied zines where people could talk about their personal experiences. They could talk about their friends, what they did last night, or a concert, or do a review of a record. So it was a very, very intimate zine and a very intimate scene as well. Um, and here on the cover, you see, on the cover of Lobotomy, you see Belinda Carlisle, which a lot of people forget that Belinda, who was the singer of the Go-Go's, was also, the Go-Go's originally were a punk band, even though they became very popular, and rightly so. I'm very proud of what they've achieved, but they started off as young punks who could barely play. So I want to tell you, for those of you who have not grown up with punk, a little bit about what punk was about. And I don't know if any of you recognize these photos, but this is an inspiration for me. This is from a little cartoon called Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And Rudolph, if you don't know this story, I don't know if you do because we're in Basque Country and I don't know if you have a Rudolph here, but Rudolph was a reindeer that had a very bright red nose, unlike all the other reindeer that had, nice dark noses that would make them fit in with all the other ones. And one day, Santa Claus needed to be guided through a very foggy night, and Rudolph came through with that bright red nose. Later on, Rudolph finds out that he's not the only one who's different. He's not the only weirdo with a bright red nose. There was also a place called the Island of Misfit Toys, where there's a train with square wheels. There's a polka dot elephant. There's a bear with wings. There's a kite that's afraid of heights, and a cowboy who rides an ostrich. These could be punks. These people could all be punks because that's what punk was about. It was about all the people who felt like maybe they didn't dress normally, maybe they had artistic ideas, maybe they were queer, and they just didn't feel connected to the people around them. They felt like outsiders. And punks felt that way, at least on the West Coast. So we all created our own island of misfit toys, and it was Hollywood. That's where we started our punk scene. And one of the things that happened that really, I think, gets left behind when people talk about punk is that what made punk special, at least what I think really made punk special, was that it had new ideas, new ways of expressing those ideas, new people that had different perspectives, people who were women who had not been given a chance before to make music, unless they were super skilled and super talented, and there was no room for somebody who just had something to say. Queers, people of color, these were the new perspectives that were being heard in punk. Suddenly all these people had the ability to make some noise, and they did it. And consequently, it didn't sound like the same boring old rock music that you'd been hearing since the 50s. Not that there's not great music in there, but you don't want to have it recycled a million times, even though, yes, you can make it different and new in your own. It's kind of cool when people came out of left field and started singing about their own experiences, and they hadn't been sung about before. So another thing I think about when I think about the Wild West is general lawlessness and the fact that it was probably dangerous. It says possibly here, but I would say probably dangerous. Um, I just chose to put women on my cover because why not? I like the fact that they're armed. I like the fact that they take care of themselves. Punk could also be a place where you might get hurt, but it's all in good fun. um, if you look at the faces here, there's exhilaration on some of those faces and maybe a little fear. And sometimes those two things go together and they work together well, I think. In the early days of punk, when I was a punk, um, we wore stiletto heels to our punk shows. The women did. Most men didn't, but some women did. And one thing that would happen is that every now and then we would have tourists that would go to the punk show, but they weren't quite sure what it was about, and they saw women that were dressed maybe in scanty clothes, and they thought, this is a good opportunity to grab a little piece of something. And if they did, there were usually a gang of us around with our stiletto heels who would pogo madly on their feet. So, so this reminds me of that. It's a way to defend ourselves. So now I want to tell you a little bit. I want to tell you a little story. And this is not a saloon. It looks like a saloon, right? After a gunfight. But this is actually a punk show that we played in 1978. Um, we were playing at a club that is traditionally more of an old style rock blues place where in the 70s they would have long rows of tables and waitresses that would come up and ask you to, aside from like the admission fee you already paid, you had a 2-drink minimum, and it was usually ridiculously priced. So this was kind of at the start of punk in LA, and this club invited us to play. But when we got there, we realized, they have those long tables. What are our friends going to do? Well, here's the answer. As soon as we got into our first song, they started throwing the furniture out of the way and literally swinging from the rafters, and it was a very wild show. Punk bands were forbidden from playing the Troubadour for many years after that, but I guess it just wasn't a place for punk at that time. There were places that we considered our own saloons, places that welcomed punk. And one place was called The Mask in Los Angeles. It's the photo that you see where people are lined up and it looks like a gutter there. The entrance was through a driveway, it was an entrance. It was a basement, basically, bomb shelter. And above you see a band called The Eyes who is playing, and you can see that there were women, people of color represented. Charlotte, who was playing there, later went on to also be in the Go-Go's. Charlotte Caffey. And down below, on the right side, you see me in my band, The Bags. We are playing in San Francisco here, and this was one of our little outposts, the Mabuhay Gardens. I think that we had different, like those pioneers that would like travel through the dangerous territory and then find a little haven. We had our own little punk outposts, and The Mabuhay Gardens was one of them. And then on the floor, you see a very fun-loving Sid Vicious, who later passed out in our dressing room. Oh, I'm sorry. Am I too close? Am I popping? Okay. So that's what life was like. So I think of the Wild West also as a place where people could experiment with their sexuality. There wasn't a lot of these people came out on their own, not with their whole families, although some did. But when I think of like saloons and the soiled doves, the prostitutes that inhabited the Wild West, and some who were possibly not prostitutes who just thought like, well, I don't have my grandparents watching over my shoulders, so let's see what life's about. So we see a lot of different, in these photographs, different sexual pairings, and just it seems like there's a lot more freedom of sexual expression and gender expression, which was also true of the punk scene. I think as much as we thought of punk as a place where we could be artistically liberated, where we could try new ways of conveying our ideas, we also challenged ourselves in our own ideology and the way we lived our lives to try different things, to be freer sexually and with gender labels. And I just put these photographs up because I like that there is some gender ambiguity here. And I don't know what happened after this, why we lost that fluidity, but it's nice to see it here. You also saw it in the punk scene where women didn't dress in a ladylike way. You didn't always feel like you wanted to be attractive in the traditional way, though I think we may have wanted to be attractive, but only to other weirdos. Like, so it wasn't in a conventional way. Punk was all about inclusion and innovation, and that's why it was the perfect place for women. Because punk never really was meant to be about how well you could play, how much you could sound like the Sex Pistols. Like, especially in these days, nobody cared about that. The more different you were, the more raw your playing or singing was, the more you were in the moment and connected to the other people in the audience, the better the punk was. And actually, we had experiences where people would come in and try to bring in their hot shot leads and their like, super produced music and try and make it sound punk. And they were just clueless because they didn't have the energy that was needed in punk to just be naked, be raw, expose yourself. It was also the perfect place for queers and people of color, as I mentioned earlier. And here again, we see some of the local bands and players in the LA punk scene. Starting at the top is a band called Nervous Gender. Then we see Carla Mad Dog playing drums, who just passed away this week. So may she rest in peace. Diane Chai playing bass for a band called the Alley Cats. If we go around clockwise, we see a band called the Screamers, who were, I think what's really interesting about the Screamers, aside from their queerness that they're famous for, is that they played synthesizers instead of guitars. I think one of the things to mention is that not everybody played the traditional rock and roll guitars. Some people chose to play water jugs with with drumsticks, or synthesizers, or make other kind of noise. The Go-Go's and Backstage Pass. So I told you that we were misfits, and I think one of the things that happens when you're a misfit is that people make assumptions about you. And when we were when punk first hit LA, I think we dressed a little bit strange and we kind of hung out together, and people started to think that we were a gang, in the sense of like a violent gang that would, I don't know, cause destruction somehow. When usually we weren't that violent, maybe just a little bit. But this is a particular concert um, that happened in 1979 in Los Angeles. And I, I attended. The first band to go on was the Go-Go's. They were just starting their career. And they, as you know, are kind of a pop punk band. They weren't super aggressive. Um, they had just started playing when this group of riot police came into the building. Now, I happened to be downstairs in the hall. I was on my way to the bathroom, and the head of the riot squad came in and he just yelled into the room, like, you have to disperse. And I, at first, like, I thought, I'm going to go up and talk to him and explain to him that this is just a concert. And as I walked over towards him, I looked out the window and I saw rows and rows of riot police, like lined up, like I'm talking about like hundreds. And they marched into this hall, and it was a beautiful old building. There were like stairs, carpeted stairs that were very wide. The riot police went up the stairs, and I went out the side, and only later heard that, you know, people had just been like clubbed by the police. And I had friends who actually went to the hospital. They had to get stitches on their heads. A friend of mine was arrested. It was a riot that was provoked by the police. It was a riot that was provoked by the riot squad. So interesting. So that's what we faced, that feeling of like being the weirdo in a new place. You're also exposed to violence. Oh, look, we're there already. So this is a part of my book, part of my book cover. So one of the things that, one of the ways that punk affected me was that it taught me not to be constrained by borders or by expectations that other people might have of me. Um, I I was living in San Diego at the time, and I went to Comic Con, and I saw my friend Jane Weedland from the Go-Go's there, and she had a comic book called Lady Robotica, and I thought, how cool to have a comic book. I love comic books. I taught myself to read in Spanish with comic books. So, so I was telling my husband, Greg, I would love to have a comic book. And then later on I went and I forgot about it, but it was in the back of my mind. And later on I went to dinner with a group of friends who wanted me to tell them about life in East LA because they were writing a play about East LA. And of course we were drinking, telling stories and enhancing them, of course. and and one of them turned and said to me, "You should write a book." And I went back home afterwards and I told my husband, they're telling me I should write a book. And he's like, yes, you should write a book. So the next morning when I woke up with my little hangover, I opened, there was a computer on the kitchen table, and it said, The True Life Adventures of Violence Girl. And my husband had set that up for me. It set up a blog. It had a comic book name. And I thought, what am I going to do? I'm not a writer. I've never studied writing. But I am a punk, and I know that if I want to do something, well, all I have to do is do it. This was a blog format, so all I had to do was write enough for a blog entry, which is like a page, right? So I started writing, and I picked up followers, and after about 6 months, I had quite a few followers, and I had enough for a book. um, excuse me. I really didn't know at the time that it would be a book. I asked my subscribers, what should I do now? And they started writing in and telling me, approach this publisher. And sure enough, I did. And this book came out in 2011. It's not as expensive as Neil's book, so I recommend it. And there's no index or anything. So, so I don't know why I put that in there. Probably just to plug my book, but I'm going back a little bit just to talk about the diversity in West Coast punk. Um, the makeup of West Coast punk, in particular in Southern California, was largely Latino, or there was quite a bit of Latino influence. As you probably know, um, California was part of Spain for a long time and then part of Mexico for a brief time. And so we have those that heritage. And so some of our music actually has that flavor. This particular band called The Plugs had a punk rock version of La Bamba, which I think is also an interesting way to look at the West as I think a lot of times when we think of it, we think of cowboys and indigenous people, but we forget that there's also people like Mexicans and Californios who were the children of the Spanish and the indigenous people. Um, and that, in fact, especially in Los Angeles, where we had governance that was Mexican and African and very diverse, that you couldn't have punk that was as punk is often um, shown in books that chronicle it as white and male. Punk in Los Angeles was anything but that. Um, Later on, bands branched off. Some bands actually did go back and form a genre called cowpunk, where they started performing some cowboy influenced, Western influenced punk. I, years later, also went back and started doing a genre that I call punkchera, which is punk and rancheras together. So we brought our own influences into it and made it a little different. So I want to talk to you a little bit about something else that happened in punk. And maybe I showed this picture a little early, but um, in Los Angeles punk, one of the places I told you we had little outposts, our own little saloons. One of the places that was welcoming to punk was Chinatown. There were a couple of clubs there, Madame Wong's and the Hong Kong Cafe, that hosted punk and new wave. New wave at Madame Wong's, punk at the Hong Kong Cafe. And and I differentiate those two by, like, punk is like stuff that you see where people are dancing wildly and slamming and uh, going kind of crazy, and new wave is a little more pop. So Blondie would be more new wave, I think. Um, anyway, we were more punk. We played these places years later. I mean, in the 2000s, about 2010, 2011, there was a nearby elementary school where there was a large Chinese and Mexican American population, and their funds for a music program were cut. So Martin Wong, one of the parents, started hosting punk rock in Chinatown to fund this elementary school's music program, which was also in Chinatown. So I did a few of those concerts, and every time that we played or even just went to a show, I noticed that there were all these little kids from the elementary school, and they were dancing and screaming and just really getting into it, and it was exciting. But a couple of the little girls that I met, or all of the little girls that I met here are in this picture. They were a little bit younger. Um, and further, if we skip forward a little bit, get us closer to the day, then this is the last story I'm going to tell you. Um, at the beginning of the pandemic, Mila, who is playing drums in the back and is the youngest member of this band, called me and said, Alice, I want to tell you about something that happened to me in school today. She said one little boy in her class, every time he passed by her, would say like, "Oh, don't get close to her. She's Chinese. They started the coronavirus, and they're going to give it to the class." And they would essentially, he was harassing her, and she was really upset about it. And so I asked her, what are you going to do? What do you think would be a good response? And she said, "I'm going to write a song." I'm like, "Yeah, you're going to write a song." And then her cousin, who is right here seen in the front singing, Eloise, who is, by the way, Martin Wong, who I mentioned organized those shows, is Martin Wong's daughter, also co-wrote that song with her, and she talks about sexism. So they wrote a song called Racist Sexist Boys, which they performed which they performed at the LA Public Library and became just a sensation. This band, by the way, they have something to say. They're also really good players. I highly recommend that you give them a listen. They are carrying forth that tradition of punk as like having no borders. They're representing for LA, which is a very diverse place. They are refreshing. So I don't have anything more to say about punk at this moment, except that I think punk will continue to grow. It'll continue to cross frontiers if we stop thinking of frontiers. I mean, if you think that we live on a sphere, there's always someone to the west, and there's always a border to be crossed. And in order to move ourselves forward, we always need to keep crossing those borders, expanding, and moving everything forward. So thank you for listening to me, and I hope you have some questions for me, because that's my favorite part. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice. So then, yeah, questions? Anybody? Comments?
Yes. Oh, microphone.
Wow, it's so great listening to you.
Thank you.
Can you? So I was connected more to the Boston scene back in the day. It was really wonderful. Can you speak more about your own musical influences, and maybe in a related way, the way in which you mentioned a bit with Latinx music influences. Can you speak more? Because that's such a difference when you're talking about regional differences, and I really appreciate hearing from you.
Yeah, I grew up listening to Mexican pop, rancheras, and my older sister played soul music. So those were my main influences when I was growing up. When I got to be a teen, I got really into glam, and I think a lot of people that got into punk were actually coming out of glam.
Yeah.
Glam music also had some of the same transgressive, they were also pushing the envelope. But unfortunately, in glam, the role of women was still more like a groupie, a muse. There wasn't as much opportunity, because with glam, you still had like people who could really play. When you think of when I think of glam, I think of Bowie, Elton John. I even think of Queen, as like really sophisticated playing, really visually and sexually and theoretically really exciting musicians. But also, there was I still felt like, well, I can't play like that, and I can't sing like Freddie Mercury or, like any of them. Right? They're great. I do remember seeing Patti Smith, and I saw Patti Smith in 1975 in a small setting, and I remember thinking, this is what a woman on stage can be. I mean, all of a sudden, she wasn't dressed up, glammed up. She wasn't dressed up like a little gift, She was like a woman rocker that brought all her intelligence to the front of the stage and made you want her. It's like she had all the animal magnetism that any male rock star that I had ever seen had. Like, she was like, I'm like, I want to fuck her and I want to be her, and I just she's still awesome, right? But these are the artists that inspired me. Also remember hearing the Ramones for the first time and hearing people laugh at them and say like, what? No real lead guitar, like, there's no leads, there's no like real, they're just doing the most basic things and they must be a joke. And the Runaways as well. And also very raw, not great chops as far as like, not great chops when you compare it to what had come before. And it's important to put it in perspective. Listening to Bohemian Rhapsody and then listening to, the Ramones, right? Or any of the things that were, music was getting really bloated right before punk came along, and it's super produced. And punk just brought it back to where, like, strip it down, just play music, say something honest, and say it in a new way. So,
Thank you.
thank you. Amaya has a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Alice.
De
It was
nada.
great to hear you. First of all, I wish I had been there. That's the first thing I thought. Okay. I was going to say that, but maybe she can talk. Okay. There was also a very big punk movement in the Basque Country in the 80s. But correct me if I'm wrong. He was also part of a bigger, like, social, political movement. Okay. The Basque Country was hard place at that time with terrorism and with a very strong nationalist movement, and I guess punk also arose from there. Okay, but Ellie, maybe you should talk about looking at it from like 30 years later. I don't think here, even if there were women within and we were there, it was not an inclusive
It
place.
was not?
Okay, it was a very masculine
Oh.
movement. Okay, and we were there and we thought we were all very alternative and very etc. But looking at it now, you say, wow, it was a very male ruled in attitude and in thought also, probably. Okay. So it's good to see that the LA movement was much more inclusive or open to. There were not that many different people too. That is true. Okay, Spain and the Basque Country was still very white in all senses. Okay, but anyway, thank you for that. I just say that you were lucky to be there.
Thank you. And I think sometimes we have to remind the men que sin la mujer no hay revolución. Without women, there is no revolution. And so, do you want to come up and talk about Basque punk? Because I would love to hear more about it. By the way, I recently found out that I have Basque heritage, so it's like really exciting for me to be here in Basque country, and to hear, especially to hear that we share some of the, like, when I hear about Basque people not being able to speak their own language in their own country, I am blown away, but also I can really relate, because when I started school, I could only speak Spanish, and my English speaking teachers would punish us if we spoke Spanish in school. So I can relate. I'm outraged, and I'm glad that you all had a your own punk way to shout out in Basque and respond to that oppression. So you both have microphones. I don't know who wants to go first.
No, I just wanted to say that at the moment when I was a punk singer as well, from a band called Cicatriz en la Matriz. After I left, I took my matriz, my bomb, because the rest were males, so there was no point to have a bomb anymore. And they became quite famous in the sort of national environment in Spain, Cicatriz. And I wasn't conscious as what we were breaking really, because there were many women on a stage at the moment in the punk. Well, some in La Movida Madrileña, some in Barcelona, El Último Resorte, gente así. But here we were many, and I just remember those times like really having a good time doing work. Just the fact that you were allowed to go on stage and say whatever you want to say and shouted it out, it was brilliant.
Well, I'm happy for you for doing that. That's great.
Thank
Hi.
you so much. This is just wonderful and really takes me back to LA in the 80s. I guess my question for you is, it seems to me that in punk, particularly as it went into the 80s in LA, there are different layers. And I think one of the things that's really great about your talk is you focus on the zines and live music. And I saw more what happened when it got to radio and records and the money and the different kinds of venues. So, I mean, did you all produce very many EPs? I know the Plugs did and some of the bands, but I'm interested in the circuits of influence and communication with the audience when largely many of these bands were not being played on the radio and not being signed by record companies, getting pressings on their own. Can you talk a little bit about the community besides the audience community?
Yeah.
The kind of methods, circuits of circulation a little bit.
Yeah, the Bags recorded 4 songs for a label called Danger House, which was a punk label, and they signed a lot of the very early bands, but they didn't have a lot of money, so I remember we went into a studio in the middle of the night, because that's when we could get free or highly discounted time, and we'd be leaving at like 10 a.m. and the next band would be coming in. Not a punk band, but we never really made money from any of those things. Like now and then we'll get somebody who's doing a movie or something and wants to license an old song, and then you get paid that way. But during that time, I don't think any of us were really focusing on that. We did want people to hear our music, but it wasn't so much. We weren't so much focused on the business end. But you grow up, and then later on you are interested in that. But so there were record labels doing that, not a lot. The Bags were fortunate because we were documented in a documentary called The Decline of Western Civilization. And The Decline of Western Civilization received wide circulation, and they also put a record out. Now, The Decline of Western Civilization was made by the director, Penelope Spheris, who was connected to Slash Records, which was also an indie label. But as such, they also had a connection to some of the artists that were in the documentary, and not to others.
Alice, one simple question. What was the relationship between the scene in LA with the San Francisco scene, or was it a one West Coast thing? Because it looks like the bands from San Francisco got a little bit more of a exposure outside the state. I think, I don't know.
I think it really was a very um, insular community. Punk really went. I mean, maybe not insular is not the right word. I mean that if you were punk and you were on the coast, you would come through the different cities that had punk. You'd play there because you were always looking for a new place to play. So we would drive to San Diego. Bands from San Diego would play in LA. Then we'd drive to San Francisco, and they would come and play in LA. And then we like go up to Portland or to Seattle. And there was like a West Coast. In fact, the Bags only did West Coast. We never played any other states, only the West Coast. And then later on, they even started including Tijuana, which is on the border, like it's in Mexico, but like right in line with all these other places. So it works out perfectly. Yeah, as far as like getting more exposure, I don't know. I mean, it's hard for me to tell. Like I don't know. I really don't. I don't see it. I feel like, there are certain bands that are really like always shown as representing West Coast punk. And I don't know that they are the bands that I would choose. A lot of times they're male fronted. And that was just not my experience. My experience was that there was a lot more women involved and people of color and definitely queers. And all of a sudden, and as history is being written, they're being erased. So, yes. Hi.
Well, first of all, thank you for everything. I'm honored to be here, really. And I have just a simple question. You mentioned using your stilettos in clubs to like hurt other people. And I was wondering, you also mentioned the Runaways, and I'm thinking of people like Joan Jett and these female icons. And I'm wondering, was femininity consciously used in the punk scene in the 70s as a tool for subversion, or was it just, or did it just happen because everyone was doing whatever and that was the subversion of it, or did you use femininity truly to, as a tool of this?
I think that the term femininity to me, like always, is kind of confusing because I think of it as like that people think feminine is a different thing than I think feminine is, right? Like I think wearing a stiletto heel could be feminine, but it could also be dangerous. I think wearing eyeliner that like is out to here and your hair sticking out like crazy can look attractive to other punks, but it doesn't, I don't know if it looks feminine. I think it's almost like redefining femininity and owning it and making it like an expression of you. And also there's an idea that like maybe I'm a little bit dangerous, and definitely I'm not anything that I'm not what you expect, So I think there was that conscious feeling of like expressing yourself. Like my friend Helen used to like she used to have a big pet snake, and I see her in several pictures posing with her snake, and it like tells you like I am a beautiful woman who is not who you should be a little bit afraid of. And I admire that. I like that women were challenging the patriarchy, challenging the status quo, and growing in self-confidence. Oh, it is? Oh, I don't know. What does it mean? I mean, I think another thing that happened is that like during the 90s, there was this like very strong male scene on the West Coast that was exclusive of women and gave birth to Riot Girl, who responded like, hey, don't make this scene all masculine. Like punk was never about reinforcing the patriarchy. It was always about challenging something, right? It was always about taking ownership of your world and making it your own. So when the Riot Girls saw this like maleness in the pit, they responded with like, girls to the front, make space for us. We, you know, they demanded it, they took it over. But there also was like an element of like, let's keep it girly, you know, like I know one of my good friends is Allison Wolf, and she always like has to like have her little hair clips and little bands and like, and is very very into not taking out that the girliness or ladylike or whatever. And whereas I am a different type of punk, you know, where I feel like some days, like I always wear a dress because I think it's more comfortable. But I have a friend who says that I'm high femme, and I'm like, if you think I'm high femme, you just have never like been in front of me when I'm singing. Because my energy is, I don't think of my energy as feminine energy, and I don't channel like any kind of things that are associated with femininity. I think I feel androgynous on stage, and I feel my energy is androgynous.
We're talking about these girls to the front, and we usually associate this with the 1990s and the Riot Girls.
Yeah.
And you were way before that.
Yeah, I'm not a Riot Girl. I'm not a Riot Girl, but I can relate to Riot Girls, and I like totally support women who are in punk and are wanting to take it back to its origins, which are inclusive.
So I have just a very quick question, going back to your book, Alice.
Yeah.
I just wonder, in terms of the way you wrote it,
Yeah.
its style, I mean, is it a punk book, or is it about punk?
It is a punk book about punk, and it's not just about punk. Actually, it's about my life, and one of the complaints I had is like, she doesn't even get to punk until like 100 pages in. It's like, well, no, because it's a story of me, and it's a story of me growing up Chicana, growing up in East LA, and how I got into punk. So, but it is totally punk. It's like, I don't know how to write, but I'm gonna write anyway. I'm gonna keep it short, like a short, sweet song. And it's going to be a little bit raw because, well, that's my life's a little bit raw. So.
And was the publisher okay with that? Did they try and change any of the way you were structuring it or writing it?
No, the publisher was totally cool. Well, he's passed on then, but he actually had met me during the punk years, and he was kind of a little bit like an awkward, quirky guy, right? And he said, you were really nice to me. And I'm like, okay, thank God it paid off. He had good memories of me. So I think he gave it a good, like, he didn't change anything. He asked me to rewrite the first page, or to write something for the first page that was more exciting than like, I was born in like. So, and I'm glad I did. I was very happy. Like all the suggestions he made, the only thing I changed that he had suggested was I changed the cover. He had a Janus head of me. I'd rather have a punk.
Well, anyway, we are running late. I also have questions that I want to ask her, but there is going to be time and opportunities later. We have stuff coming, so I'm sorry that we have to stop here. So thank you again, Alice, for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.